Hello and welcome to the podcast PFI Talks, which is brought to you by Prague Finance Institute and the leading Czech economics research center, CERGE. It is my pleasure to welcome world-renowned economics professor Jeffrey Sachs. Hello, sir.
Great to be with you.
So let's turn to the first block of our questions. Since many economists lately have been slashing their forecast for global and regional GDP growth, especially when they're looking forward into the next 2 years, and all, given the still unclear impact of COVID policies that were implemented globally since early 2020, and also the most recent impact on the global economy by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So if you are looking at these sort of events that have been spanning over the past 2 years, what is your prediction regarding the global economic development, growth and inflation for the next 24 months? And what do you think policymakers should be doing about sort of navigate those rough waters that seem to be ahead? And maybe you don't think that there are any rough waters ahead.
No, we're definitely in rough waters. We're in a crisis. The crisis will get worse in the coming months, and it could get far worse. We're experiencing stagflation, meaning that there are rising prices at the same time that output is falling in many parts of the world. Europe is already in a downturn. The United States is entering a downturn. China is in some kind of economic downturn. So this is a global economic crisis. And so I regard the overall economic situation as bad as I've seen in decades, worse than in 2008. We're likely to experience some very significant shocks in the months ahead. Of course, the most crucial question is what happens to geopolitics? Does war spread? Does it intensify? Does it diminish? Is there a return to the negotiating table? Do the US and China come to blows which would disrupt global society? Do they find a way to talk with each other? These are the questions that we're facing right now.
It's true that this is all also happening on the backdrop of an immense debt leverage that the global economy. What do you think is the optimal solution to the current global debt overhang? And by debt, I mean private,
everything.
public, everything. I'm just rounding up. I don't even want to think about the figure because it's too many zeros. So what's the solution to that so it doesn't threaten the world's global financial system and stability?
It's a great question. Again, in the last stagflation that we had in the late 1970s, what happened was that the inflation in the United States reached around 10% per year, and the Fed, under a 6'7", a 2-meter chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, cigar-smoking, tough guy, he said, we're going to end this inflation, and he put interest rates up to 20%. And by the time it was over, all the developing countries were bankrupt. It was unbelievable. Well, it made my career because I spent the next decade helping countries get out of debt crisis, which had laid them completely flat. So if we go into this just with the naive financial squeeze right now, we'll end up with a lot of carnage, meaning a lot of countries in default, a lot of very high inflation rates. You look at a country like Turkey now. They have not managed their economy properly for years, but the inflation rate is reaching 100% per year right now. Argentina, the inflation rate is reaching 100%. There will be other countries experiencing this kind of runaway inflation. Maybe Ukraine is going to have a hyperinflation by the end of this crisis. Of course, we don't know.
But unlike 30 years ago or 40 years ago, actually, well, almost 50 to be exact, is the developed world, are the developed economies and their financial system insulated from this impact that could be coming again from emerging markets or developing economies?
It's interesting, of course, in the 2010s, because the European Central Bank did not do a very good job under its president, Trichet, in the early years of the last decade. Greece nearly went bankrupt. And it wasn't so far for Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and even Italy.
And Slovenia.
So the Eurozone and Slovenia, the Eurozone almost collapsed. And it required Draghi's deft hand to prevent that collapse. Basically, the European Central Bank had to act as a lender of last resort to prevent a disaster. So central banks and their wisdom or lack of wisdom will determine a lot. In 2008, the Fed and the US Treasury stupidly drove Lehman Brothers into a bankruptcy one weekend in September 2008, and it cost the whole world trillions of dollars, that technical mistake that they made. And so when you're in a crisis, the first thing to say is these institutions are not so reliable. They're not so smart. They're not so foolproof that they necessarily avoid real damage. What we need to come to the positive answer to your question is we need to avoid a contagion of defaults and a contagion of insolvencies. And we also need to avoid simply telling dozens of countries, you need to contract sharply your public investment and your social spending and so forth.
So you effectively coming full circle from what, being the sort of from professing shock therapies, you are coming full circle into actually going against these sort of fiscal cuts in the country.
No. Remember, when I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis in the debtor countries.
And in debt relief, regardless the potential risk of moral hazard
debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, and it depends very much on the specific circumstances, that countries get the kinds of development finance that they need, even on a larger scale than now. And I'm talking about new debts on a long-term, low-interest rate basis so that these countries can continue to develop without going into default today. It's a tricky proposition for countries that have borrowed on the Eurobond market, governments that owe money right now. It may be that they have to say to the creditors, well, we need to extend the horizon for repayment under certain kinds of contracts where there are collective action clauses, this can be done fairly smoothly. And probably many countries are going to have to take that chance. When it comes to official credits that a government owes to a rich country government or to the World Bank or to some other international institution, I'm recommending a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985.
And is it achievable under the current circumstances when the US Fed is fighting a 40-year high inflation and has been pushing up interest rates higher to the unprecedented high for, let's say, several decades going back, because that's actually been increasing the debt load or debt gearing of and debt servicing costs for all the EMs or developing countries?
It's going to be a close call for several reasons, but let me put it this way. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. The 30-year bond rate for German debt is still around 1%, actually. The 30-year bond rate for Ghana or for an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. In other words, I am advocating a significant increase of official financing at interest rates that the Treasury or the German government or other Eurozone countries pay themselves. The real room for maneuver is that the interest rates paid by the high-income countries are still very low compared to what the emerging market economies face. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the US government or German government or Japanese government can borrow at, and therefore lend at quite low and long-term interest rates to emerging markets that, if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.
And then we are back into the whole idea of the currently lack of cooperation will on the global level. We have to get back to...
There you go. So I'm recommending to the G20 this approach. But is there a G20 even right now? Countries are barely talking to each other. The US and Russia literally are not talking to each other, of course. US and China barely talking to each other and cooperating on something as bold as avoiding a financial crisis. Somehow it's not going well. And for me, all through my career, even when I didn't understand it properly at the time, it has been determined by geopolitics. Will something work or won't it work? Because you need cooperation. If the cooperative environment is there, a lot can get done. If there is no cooperation, the chance for a contagion is very, very real. This, I think, is what we face right now.
I have a last question on this topic. The ECB is facing a real difficult times and dilemma. Even, I mean, it's behind the tightening curve, launched by the Fed earlier in the season. What can ECB do to actually, put its policies back straight on the right course of sustaining that kind of development and preventing any global financial crisis or maybe world world financial crisis number 2 following 2008, 2009?
Well, I think Europe is in an extremely difficult situation, not mainly because of the ECB, but mainly because of the war in Ukraine and the vulnerability on energy, obviously. Europe's already in a downturn. It could get quite severe in the coming months. My position on this is not popular in Europe among the politicians, but as I've emphasized, my position is that there is a negotiated way out of this. I don't believe the NATO line that, well, we're just going to fight till we defeat Putin. If that is the approach, I don't think it's going to succeed on the battlefield. And I also think that the consequences economically will become quite unmanageable. The crisis will be very serious in my view. Now, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I believe that the energy crisis and all of the uncertainties around it and all of the other ramifications, and you compound that with the growing break with China as well, I think will lead to a very significant crisis in Europe. And since we see the politics are already quite unstable in a number of countries, including Italy, for example, where the Draghi government has just fallen, and who knows what will happen next with elections coming up. I think that the chance of revisiting a deep Eurozone crisis becomes very real. So I don't see the pieces working very well right now. And the ECB can only do so much in this context. I think it's going to have an extremely difficult time unless we find a way to peace and to easing the very, very high tensions right now.
You are viewed, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the co-author or co-father of the United Nations development goals that are used in the currently, often discussed ESG policies. And you are the Columbia University director of the Center for Sustainable Development. And what does it mean? What is your typical day like in this role?
Great question. Typically, it's Zooming from early morning till late at night, because now in our digital world, we can meet and speak all over the world rather conveniently.
And do it sustainably.
And do it depending on how exactly the electricity is provided for our Zooms. That remains a question, but it's much more sustainable than getting on an airplane for every meeting that one has to have. I spend a tremendous amount of my day, every day, working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Mm-hmm. I believe, as I've been emphasizing, that global cooperation is necessary, is vital, and is feasible. I don't believe in a divided world. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in democracies versus autocracies. I don't believe in cold wars or hot wars. I believe that our environmental and social crises are so severe that we need cooperation right now above all of the differences that we might suppose to divide the world. And so I speak with the Chinese, I speak with Latin America, African leaders, European leaders, all the time. And I promote solutions, as we discussed, for the financial crisis, which is deepening, for the climate crisis, which is deepening. And I help to lead a network of more than 1,500 universities around the world to address, through education and research and policy analysis, how to promote sustainable development. Mm-hmm. And war is my enemy, obviously, because it's the biggest distraction. It sucks up all the energy. It destroys so much faster than we can possibly build. It undermines every opportunity for trust and partnership. So these days, I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to see, is there some way to overcome this two-front crisis that we face with Russia and China against the U.S. And its alliance. And I always appeal for Europe to be smarter in its diplomacy, because Europe has the values of sustainable development, yet it's caught in war. And I want to see Europe get out of this trap of war, not fall into a trap of a new battle with China, and help lead the way to a cooperative approach to sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the latest efforts by US and EU authorities in sort of codifying the ESG rules? How do you see the current approach to that? Whether it should be sort of more better codified from the above rather than sort of driven from below by the markets?
It definitely, we need top-down codification and top-down policies. And very broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is a valid, smart, I would say sophisticated approach. It's got many limitations, but the European Green Deal is a framework that the 27 have adopted. It can serve as a roadmap. It's not exactly a plan, of course, and there are 1,000 details to be argued every day. Is natural gas really green? Is nuclear green? And so on. So these are inevitable points of debate. But broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is well done and well worth achieving, and well worth promoting diplomatically, to say to the Latin American countries, to the African Union, to ASEAN, and so on, you need a Green Deal the same way we have a Green Deal. Europe could really provide a lot of leadership that way.
When it comes to the Green Deal taxonomy, what's really important for the Czech Republic and even some other Central European countries, do you think that the nuclear power should be viewed as sustainable going forward, and that Germany should actually bring its, sort of reverse its policy of shutting down nuclear power plants?
I think nuclear power, if, and this is a big if it can be managed safely, so that with the absolute state-of-the-art safety systems, especially passive safety systems, offers a component of the zero carbon energy system. I'm not myself a purist that says absolutely no to nuclear power. Of course, it raises many issues. Fissile materials, nuclear safety, nuclear waste, and the alternatives, because if you could do it without nuclear through an efficient system of wind, solar, hydro, and so forth, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think within the practical context, there's no doubt that nuclear power is going to continue to play its role, obviously in France, obviously in Central Europe, obviously in China, in Korea, in
Ukraine,
a lot of
in
countries
Russia.
in the world. In Russia and Ukraine, I would expect so also, absolutely.
Well, says Jeffrey Sachs, the professor of sustainability at Columbia University. Thank you very much for your time talking to us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Great to be with you.